Hello and welcome to Inside the Americas. Coming up on the program, it's coming down to the wire for the U.S. Congress to pass a deal on raising the debt limit. Some hard-right Republicans are in open revolt after their leader in the House reached a tentative deal with the White House over the weekend. Leaders of South American countries gather in Brazil for a historic meeting, their first in 9 years. Brazilian President Lula da Silva holding discussions with Venezuela's authoritarian leader Nicolas Maduro. We'll have some analysis from Oliver Farry from our International Affairs Desk. And a 25-year-old model is hoping to become the first ever transgender woman to win the title of Miss Venezuela. She says she's received both messages of support and threats since announcing she would compete. Thanks for tuning in. With the fate of the world financial markets hanging in the balance, the U.S. Congress is one step closer to raising the debt limit. Republican House Leader Kevin McCarthy reached a tentative deal with President Biden, but he's still facing a revolt from far-right members of his own party. If lawmakers don't pass the bill by Monday, the world's largest economy is set to default for the first time in history. So what exactly is in the deal? Andrew Hillier explains.
The debt ceiling deal was weeks in the making. It was reached after talks between Democratic President Joe Biden and Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. So what are some of the agreement's key provisions? Crucially, the deal would suspend the debt ceiling until 2025, averting a potential default on U.S. debt payments. It means the U.S. government could borrow money to pay its bills until well after the next presidential election in November 2024.
It takes the threat of catastrophic default off the table, protects our hard-earned and historic economic recovery, and the agreement also represents a compromise, which means no one got everything they want.
Republicans had long argued for a freeze on spending. The agreement caps non-defense spending at the same level throughout 2024 and raises it by only 1% the year after, but it doesn't freeze the defense budget. The agreement also claws back unspent coronavirus relief funds. That's a big win for Republicans and could see roughly $30 billion returned to the federal government. But there are some glaring omissions. There'll be no tax hikes for wealthy Americans, something Democrats had insisted on including. Biden's plan to forgive student debt has also survived, despite hard lobbying by Republicans to get it revoked.
Next to Nova Scotia, where wildfires have scorched some 1 million acres, and that's our number of the week. The blazes have forced some 18,000 people to leave their homes. That includes people who live in parts of Bedford and near Halifax. The fire started on Sunday, leading to the declaration of a state of emergency in the region. At least 200 homes and other buildings have been destroyed by the flames. Well, it's their first meeting in 9 years. Leaders from the regional bloc previously known as the Union of South American Nations gathered this week in Brazil. The 11 countries are showing a renewed sense of cooperation, with Brazilian President Lula da Silva meeting with Venezuela's authoritarian president Nicolas Maduro. The two nations had broken off ties under Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. Oliver Farry is here from our International Affairs Desk. Oliver, so is this a case of Nicolas Maduro back in from the cold in South America?
Well, it's not the greatest surprise in the world that Nicolas Maduro has been invited back to Brazil. Lula was an ally of Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, and Latin America itself is actually quite divided on the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Some countries have actually supported his erstwhile challenger Juan Guaido, depending on their own government at the time. That's including Brazil as well. Maduro is very much a pariah in the West, but it's not so clear-cut in South America. Brazil also shares a very long border with Venezuela, and so basic cooperation is necessary. That said, there are some people within Brazil, including allies of Lula himself, who are a little bit surprised that he went out of his way to welcome him. Lula called US sanctions on Venezuela extremely exaggerated. He also criticized the US for denying legitimacy to Maduro's government. There was no mention of the human rights violations that Maduro has been accused of. Now, there's a sense that Lula is actually quite emboldened in his second stint in office. He probably feels that he doesn't really need to be as diplomatic as he was before. We see this with the very independent course that he's plotting with regard to Russia in Ukraine and also with regard to China. Supporters of Jair Bolsonaro during the election last year said that if Lula were re-elected, Brazil would turn into Venezuela. Now, this was clearly far-fetched and an exaggeration, but Lula cozying up to Nicolas Maduro again will probably be grist to the mill for a lot of these people.
Well, so the left is back in power, at least in Brazil, but the far right still maintains quite a presence across the continent.
Yes, well, South America is a continent, and Latin America indeed as a whole is a continent where the political pendulum tends to swing quite wildly. That's done throughout history. The reaction to left-wing governments is quite often very hard right ones, sometimes by free democratic elections, but just as often through military coups. In many countries, populism tends to do well on both the left and the right. Now, right-wing parties can get quite reactionary in Latin America. There's a massive disparity in many countries between rich and poor, and many richer people really feel a siege mentality, so they tend to vote for a lot of more hard right parties. This was evident in the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. It was also seen in the last presidential election in Chile, where the left-wing leader Gabriel Boric faced off against Jose Antonio Cast, who was quite right-wing. His father, indeed, was a Nazi in Germany. Now, in recent years, right and left have peacefully exchanged power in formerly authoritarian countries such as Argentina and Chile. Brazil looked like it could have some trouble earlier this year when Jair Bolsonaro supporters refused to accept the legitimacy of the election, but the chaos was averted in the end. Now, quite crucially, the United States and other Western countries stood by Lula and called for the elections to be respected. It was significant that a similar scenario had actually happened in the United States after the 2020 election. So the United States is not turning its back on left-wing governments in South America today, which is very much different from when it was during the Cold War.
Okay, Oliver Farry from our International Affairs Desk. Oliver, thanks so much for that analysis. Well, as Brazil plays host to other South American nations, it's dealing with some controversy at home. The country's lower house of Congress has approved a bill to limit the recognition of new Indigenous reservations. In reaction, Indigenous rights groups have planned a week of protests in the capital. Allison Sargent has the story.
A volley of arrows slicing through tear gas launched by Brazilian police. Dozens of Indigenous protesters blocked a highway on the outskirts of Sao Paulo Tuesday as lawmakers voted to limit the designation of their protected lands.
We are from these lands and we will resist. We will not accept violence.
Resistance and land demarcation now.
The bill passed by Brazil's lower house of Congress would make it so that new reserves can only be established on land that was occupied by Indigenous people in 1988, when Brazil's current constitution came into effect. But critics point out that some areas weren't occupied by Indigenous people at the time because they'd been expelled during the military dictatorship, which had ended just several years before. Around a third of Brazil's Indigenous territories have yet to be formally recognized, and the new requirement will make it hard for President Lula da Silva to fulfill his promise of protecting them.
We're going to have to work hard so that we can recognize as many Indigenous lands as possible.
Lula is seeking to undo the damage of his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, who oversaw a surge in illegal logging and mining in the Amazon. But Brazil's Congress remains dominated by conservatives, and the legislation was fast-tracked after pressure from Brazil's powerful agricultural lobby. The bill still has to be approved by the Senate. Lula could then refuse to sign, but Congress could override his veto. Meanwhile, the issue of Indigenous land recognition is also being examined by Brazil's Supreme Court.
25-year-old model is hoping to become the first ever transgender woman to win the title of Miss Venezuela. Before the nationally televised event, a panel will select 24 contestants, and Sofia Solomon is hoping to be among them. She says she's received both messages of support and threats since announcing she would compete. Venezuela is a religiously conservative country where homophobia and transphobia are prevalent, and Solomon says she's taking it all in stride.
I was in a restaurant here in Caracas and a person told me, hey, you're Sofia Salomon, the transgender girl who's going to participate in Miss Venezuela. And then that echoed and people began to ask questions. And that's what it's about, is to give visibility to something nobody talks about, nobody knows. All eyes are on what happens at Miss Venezuela. Me being there would make history.
And finally, a statue paying tribute to the Argentinian football coach Marcelo Gallardo is causing a stir on social media. The bronze sculpture is 8 meters high, which is impressive enough, but it's the size about halfway up that's causing some raised eyebrows. The artist said she deliberately over-exaggerated Gallardo's groin area, saying it was not sexual, but rather spoke to his vitality. Some fans said the statue showed a lack of respect for the legendary coach. Others mocked the club for not showing images of the whole statue on its social media accounts. The artist says that real fans understand what she was trying to say. I think that gives new meaning to the phrase, go big or go home. And that does it for this edition of Inside the Americas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Want to know? Find out here.
With France 24, learn to tell what's true from what's fake on social networks.
Identify the false rumors in European news stories.
Get reliable information about migration.
Truth or fake, every day we bring you information that is verified and put into context.
France 24 is news you can rely on every day across all platforms.